Hi, everybody. You're reading with Jimmy. This is Jimmy, and we're reading chapters 4 and 5 of A Farewell to Arms. Let's begin. Okay. Before we begin, I want to talk about a couple of things we mentioned in the last when we read the first three chapters. One of them is this section right here at the end of chapter 3. And I want to touch on that because that's very important to understanding this story, this novel. I tried to tell about the night and the difference between the night and the day, and how the night was better unless the day was very clean and cold, and I could not tell it, semicolon. Remember the way his style is, the narrator, he's writing long stream of consciousness things. So he's also using pronouns. I want you to remember the use of pronouns here. And I could not tell it, the word it. That's a pronoun meaning it. What is it? Think about this. I tried to tell about the night and the difference between the night and the day, and how the night was better unless the day was clean and cold. And I could not tell it. Whatever it is. We don't know what it is, and he's not clear on what it is. And we're going to have to read the whole novel to figure out what the heck it is. As I cannot tell it now. So he's narrating now, whenever that is. It's probably at the end. He's gone through all this, and all his adventures have happened already. And he says, as I cannot tell it now. Now meaning when this is going on. But if you have had it, you know. He, the priest, had not had it, but he understood that I had really wanted to go to the Abruzzi, but had not gone, and we were still friends with many tastes alike, but with the difference between us. What difference is that? That he had not had it, and the narrator had. He had always known what I did not know, and when I learned it, I was always able to forget. There's the it again. He had always known what I did not know, and when I learned it, I was always able to forget. Probably one of the most important sentences that you're going to read in this novel. And I don't necessarily know that you and I and anyone else listening can define it yet. But we're going to go back to this section over and over and over again throughout the analysis until we figure out what you think it is. But I did not know that then, although I learned it later. What did he learn? This sentence. He'd always known what it was, but he was able to forget it, whatever it is. You see, this is not easy, right? But it's also not Shakespeare, so don't worry about it. The other thing I want to touch on before we begin is what I mentioned I would touch on, peripheral vision. Peripheral vision. You know, when you look through your eyes are remarkable, aren't they? You can focus your eye. And then you also, when you look at something, like if you're looking at this number 4, you can see everything around that 4 kind of like a blur, right? Am I right? So you have this central focus, but then you have your peripheral vision that goes all the way around that 4 to probably extending outside the screen into the room, perhaps if you're by a window, outside the window. So peripheral vision, which often we don't think about, is actually greater than your focused vision. You need to focus, of course, but peripheral vision, and there are some diseases where some people don't have that, which is sad, but peripheral vision is very important. So in this sentence from the first one, the priest, not with girls, went on the captain. This is when the captain is teasing the priest. Priest never with girls. He explained to me. And then he took my glass and filled it, looking at my eyes all the time, but not losing sight of the priest. Priest every night with 5 to 1. So he's teasing the priest. He's pouring the narrator a glass, looking at him directly, but never losing sight of the priest. Never losing sight of the priest is his peripheral vision. Why is peripheral vision important? Jimmy was in a car accident several years ago, and he saw the car coming through the red light, and if he didn't turn and swerve because of his peripheral vision, he would have been T-boned and probably dead, and you would not be listening to my voice now. But he saw the peripheral vision, and peripheral vision is very important, for example, for law enforcement, situational awareness. All your vision is a remarkable miracle, isn't it? Peripheral vision. But in this case, peripheral vision will play a role in the novel, as you'll see. It's very important because we're going to be focused on the narrator and what happens to the narrator, but don't forget your peripheral vision. So what you've been seeing here is I try to title the chapters as we go through it, but I'm not going to, that's just my notes. And I told you I'm going to read the story, but we're also going to stop to analyze it whenever the muse arises, right? Whenever the feeling arises that we share. But if you see something and I don't stop to talk about it and you want to talk about it, Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com, Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. Let's go. Chapter 4. This is book 1, chapter 4 of A Farewell to Arms. The battery in the next garden woke me up in the morning, and I saw the sun coming through the window and got out of bed. I went to the window and looked down. The gravel paths were moist, and the grass was wet with dew. The battery fired twice, and the air came each time like a blow and shook the window and made the front of my pajamas flap. I couldn't see the guns, but they were evidently firing directly over us. It was a nuisance to have them there, but it was a comfort that they were no bigger. As I looked out at the garden, I heard a motor truck starting on the road. I dressed, went downstairs, had some coffee in the kitchen, and went out to the garage. 10 cars were lined up side by side under the long shed. They were top-heavy, blunt-nosed ambulances, painted gray and built like moving vans. The mechanics were working on one out in the yard, and 3 others were out in the mountains at the dressing stations. Do they shell the battery? I asked one of the mechanics. Oh, no, Signor Tenente. It's protected by the little hill. Tenente is lieutenant. So now we learn more about the narrator. He's a lieutenant. We already knew he's an officer. How? Because he went to the body house for officers. But now we learn he's a lieutenant. Maybe we learned that before. I forgot. Isn't this wonderful? How's everything? The narrator asks. Not so bad. This machine is no good, but the others march. He stopped working and smiled. Were you on permission? Yes. I'm going to change the scope of this so we can see it a little bit better. Give me a second. Thank you very much. We're going to go to the next page. He wiped his hands on his jumper and grinned. You have a good time? The others all grinned too. Fine, I said. What's the matter with this machine? Oh, it's no good. One thing after another. Well, what's the matter now? New rings. I left them working. This is important up here, too, because a lot of times they live experiences of the person who was on leave. Permission meant was he on leave? And remember, he just came back from leave. And the first, right? I left them working, the car looking disgraced and empty with the engine open and the parts spread out on the workbench. And I went under the shed and looked at each of the cars. So remember, these are ambulances now, so we're getting more clues and information about what he does, the narrator. They were moderately clean, a few freshly washed, the others dusty. I looked at the tires carefully, looking for cuts and stone bruises. You should check your tires, right? The tires are between you and the road. So he's checking the tires of these trucks, these ambulances. Everything seemed in good condition. Seemed. It evidently made no difference whether I was there to look after things or not. So remember, he was on leave. I had imagined that the condition of the cars, whether or not things were obtainable, the smooth functioning of the business of removing wounded and sick from the dressing stations, hauling them back from the mountains to the clearing station, and then distributing them to the hospitals named on the papers, depended on a considerable extent on myself. Now we know what the narrator does. He's an ambulance driver. He takes the wounded, right, from the mountains to the clearing stations and then distributes them to the hospitals. So evidently it didn't matter whether I was there or not. Wow, it doesn't matter. There was a great philosopher called Nietzsche who said the biggest insult you can give someone is indifference, the being indifferent. That's if you say something, I hate you. Well, that's an insult, right? You're an ass. That's an insult, right? If you want to insult someone, be indifferent. I think Nietzsche was right? Frederic Nietzsche. Check it out. Has there been any trouble getting parts? I asked the sergeant mechanic. No, Signor Tenente. Well, where is the gasoline parked now? It's at the same place. Good, I said. And I went back into the house, drank another bowl of coffee at the mess table. The coffee was pale gray and sweet with condensed milk. Outside the window, it was a lovely spring morning. There was the beginning of the feeling of dryness in the nose, which meant that the day would be hot later on. That day I visited the posts in the mountains and was back in town late in the afternoon. The whole thing seemed to run better while I was away. That's an interesting comment by the narrator, right? It ran better while he was away. In other words, he doesn't mean much to the operation. The offensive was going to start again, I heard. Offensive. The war is going on. We're going to talk about offensives in World War I shortly. The division for which we worked were to attack at the place up the river, and the major told me that I would see about the posts during the attack. The attack would cross the river above the narrow gorge and spread up the hillside. The posts for the cars would have to be as near the river as they could get and keep covered. They would, of course, be selected by the infantry, but we were supposed to work it out. It was one of those things that gave you a false feeling of soldiering. So they're working with the infantry who's supposed to advance. They're the ambulance drivers for the wounded, etc., etc. I was very dusty and dirty, and I went up to my room to wash, and Rinaldi was sitting on his bed with a copy of Hugo's English Grammar. He was dressed, he wore his black boots, and his hair shone. Splendid, he said when he saw me. You will come with me to see Miss Barkley. No. Yes, you will please come and make me a good impression on her. Remember, this is an Italian talking either English or in Pidgin Italian for the narrator's sake, who's in English. He speaks English, but he also speaks Italian, not fluently, but fluent enough. All right, the narrator says, wait till I get cleaned up. Wash up and come as you are. I washed, brushed my hair, and we started. Wait a minute, Rinaldi said. Perhaps we should have a drink. He opened his trunk and took out a bottle. That's Strega, I said. No, Grappa. All right. So I wrote a note up here. Grappa is a fragrant spirit, 75 to 120 proof. You're going to see a lot of drinking in here. It's important to understand what they drink, how they drink, why they drink. Made from grape skins and other solids left over from the winemaking process. Strega, which is a yellow liqueur made from 70 ingredients, including saffron, which gives it its color, and it's used in the digestive and dessert recipes. So not straight. He doesn't want to drink that. And he says, no, it's grappa. All right, says the narrator. He poured 2 glasses. We touched them, first fingers extended. The grappa was very strong. Another? All right, I said. We drank the second grappa, and Rinaldi put away the bottle, and we went down the stairs. It was hot walking through the town, but the sun was starting to go down, and it was very pleasant. The British hospital was a big villa built by the Germans before the war. Miss Barkley was in the garden, and another nurse was with her. We saw their white uniforms through the trees, and we walked toward them. Rinaldi saluted. I saluted too, but more moderately. How do you do? Miss Barkley said. You're not Italian, are you? Oh, no, said the narrator. Rinaldi was talking with the other nurse. They were laughing. What an odd thing to be in the Italian army. It's not really the army, says the narrator. It's only the ambulance. It's very odd, though. Well, why did you do it? I don't know, I said. There isn't always an explanation for everything. Oh, isn't there? Says Miss Barkley. I was brought up to think that there was. Well, that's awfully nice, says the narrator. Do we have to go on and talk this way? Says Barkley. No, I said. That's a relief, isn't it? She says. What is the stick? I asked. Miss Barkley was quite tall. She wore what seemed to be a nurse's uniform, was blonde, and had a tawny skin and gray eyes. I thought that she was very beautiful. She was carrying a thin rattan stick, like a toy riding crop, bound in leather. She says, it belonged to a boy who was killed last year. I'm awfully sorry, says the narrator. He was a very nice boy. He was going to marry me, and he was killed in the Somme. Somme is one of the worst battles of World War II. There's a note up here. The Battle of the Somme is a major battle in the First World War fought by the armies of the British and the French against the Germans. The Germans are not seen too often in here, but they're dreaded. The Germans are dreaded. They're great fighters. It took place on July 1st and the 18th, November 1960s. Both sides, the upper reaches of the River Somme. The opening day of the attack saw the British Army sustain 57,000 casualties, the bloodiest day in its history, and 19,240 fatalities. Think about that, ladies and gentlemen. One battle, 57,000 casualties, 19,240 fatalities. The difference are the people who were wounded, and now you know what the ambulances do. They bring the wounded back. Horrible, just horrible. So the boy that she's carrying this rattan stick for was killed at the Somme. Narrator says it was a ghastly show. She says, were you there? No. I've heard about it, she said. There's not really any war of that sort down here. They sent me the little stick. His mother sent it to me. They returned it with his things. Had you been engaged long, says the narrator? 8 years. We grew up together, she says. And why didn't you marry? I don't know, she said. I was a fool not to. I could have given him that anyway. I thought it would be bad for him. I see, said the narrator. Have you ever loved anyone? Says Barkley. No, I said. We sat down on the bench and I looked at her. You have beautiful hair, I said. Do you like it? Very much. I was going to cut it all off when he died. No, says the narrator. I wanted to do something for him. You see, I didn't care about the other thing, and he could have had it all. He could have had anything he wanted if I would have known. I would have married him or anything. I know all about it now, but then he wanted to go to war, and I didn't know anything. There's the it again. See the word? See the pronoun? The other thing. What do you think that is? You see, I didn't care about the other thing. What do you think that is, ladies and gentlemen? What do you think that is? And I know all about it now, whatever it is. Is that the thing, the other thing, or is it something else? The style of the narrator is what the narrator is doing is writing dialogue. And again, he's inside the story, first person narrator. So we should believe what he's saying until he's proven guilty of lying. And so far, he's just narrating stuff, right? And the way he narrates is his style. And I don't know if the narrator can define it for us. So he just uses the pronoun. I did not say anything. I didn't know about anything then, says Barkley. I thought it would be worse for him. I thought perhaps he couldn't stand it. And then, of course, he was killed. And that was the end of it. Okay? She didn't marry him. With marriage comes, right? Sexual relationships, right? Sexual relationships. And maybe that's what she's talking about. I thought it would be worse for him if they were married and had relations. I don't know, said the narrator. Oh, yes, she said. That's the end of it. And he's responding to this sentence, and that's the end of it. And he says, well, I don't know if that would be worse. And he's responding to something, and she says, no, that's the end of it. We looked at Rinaldi talking with the other nurse. What's her name? The narrator says. Ferguson, Helen Ferguson, new character. Your friend is a doctor, isn't he? Yes, he's very good, says the narrator. Well, that's splendid. You rarely find anyone any good this close to the front. This is close to the front, isn't it? Quite. It's a silly front, she said. But it's very beautiful. Are they going to have an offensive? Yes. Then we'll have to work. There's no work now. Have you done nursing long? Since the end of 1915. I started when he did. I remember having a silly idea that he might come to the hospital where I was with a saber cut, I suppose, and a bandage around his head, or shot through the shoulder, something picturesque. This is the picturesque front, I said. Yes, she said. People can't realize what France is like. If they did, it couldn't all go on. It. He didn't have a saber cut. They blew him all to bits. I didn't say anything. Do you suppose it will always go on? No. What will stop it? It will crack somewhere, the narrator says. Will crack. Will crack in France. They can't go on doing things like the Somme and not crack. They won't crack here, I said. You think not? She says. No. They did very well last summer. Well, they may crack, she said. Anybody may crack. The Germans, too. No, I think not. We went over toward Rinaldi and Miss Ferguson. You love Italy? Rinaldi asked Miss Ferguson in English. Quite well, Ferguson said. No understand, Rinaldi shook his head. Abbastanza bene, I translated. He shook his head. That is not good. You love England? Not too well. I'm Scotch, you see. Rinaldi looked at me blankly. She's Scotch, so she loves Scotland better than England, I said in Italian. But Scotland is England. I translated this for Miss Ferguson. Passancore, said Miss Ferguson. Not really? Never. We do not like the English. Not like the English? Not like Miss Barkley? Oh, that's different. You mustn't take everything so literally. You see, literally translations, right? And after a while, we said goodnight and left. And walking home, Rinaldi said, Miss Barkley prefers you to me. That is very clear. But that little Scotch one is very nice. Very, I said. I hadn't noticed her. You like her? No, said Rinaldi. Chapter 5. I titled it The Narrator and Miss Barkley. The next afternoon, I went to call on Miss Barkley again, and she was not in the garden. And when I went to the side door of the villa where the ambulances drove up, inside I saw the head nurse, who said Miss Barkley was on duty. There's a war on, you know. I said I knew. You're the American in the Italian army, she asked. Yes, ma'am. How did you happen to do that? Why didn't you join up with us? I don't know, I said. Could I join now? I'm afraid not now. Tell me, why did you join up with the Italians? I was in Italy, I said, and I spoke Italian. Oh, she said, I'm learning it. It's a beautiful language. Somebody said you should be able to learn it in 2 weeks. Oh, I'll not learn it in 2 weeks. I've studied it for months now. You may come and see her after 7 o'clock if you wish. She'll be off then. But don't bring a lot of Italians. Not even for the beautiful language? No, nor for their beautiful uniforms. Good evening, I said. Arrivederci, tenente. Arrivederci. I saluted and went out. It was impossible to salute foreigners as an Italian without embarrassment. The Italian salute never seemed made never made for export. The day had been hot. I had been up the river to the bridgehead at Plava. It was there that the offensive was to begin. It had been impossible to advance on the far side the year before because there was only one road leading down the pass to the pontoon bridge, and it was under machine gun and shell fire for nearly a mile. It was not wide enough either to carry all of the transport for an offensive, and the Austrians could make a shambles of it. But the Italians had crossed and spread out a little way on the far side to hold about 1.5 miles on the Austrian side of the river. It was a nasty place, and the Austrians should not have let them hold it. I suppose it was mutual tolerance because the Austrians still kept a bridgehead further down the river. The Austrian trenches were above the hillside only a few yards from the Italian lines. There had been a little town, but it was all rubble. There was what was left of a railway station and a smashed permanent bridge that could not be repaired and used because it was in plain sight. I went along the narrow road down toward the river, left the car at the dressing station under the hill, crossed the pontoon bridge, which was protected by the shoulder of the mountain, and went through the trenches in the smashed downtown and along the edge of the slope. Everybody was in the dugouts. There were racks of rockets standing to be touched off to call for help from the artillery or to signal with it if the telephone wires were cut. It was quiet, hot, and dirty. I looked across the wire at the Austrian lines. Nobody was in sight. I had a drink with the captain that I knew in one of the dugouts, and then I went back across the bridge. A new wide road was being finished that would go over the mountain and then zigzag down to the bridge. When this road was finished, the offensive would start. It came down through the forest in sharp turns. The system was to bring everything down the new road and take the empty trucks and carts and loaded ambulances and all the returning traffic up the old narrow road. The dressing station was on the Austrian side of the river under the edge of the hill, and stretcher bearers would bring the wounded back across the pontoon bridge. It would be the same when the offensive started. As far as I could make out, the last mile or so of the new road where it started to level out would be able to be shelled steadily by the Austrians. It looked as though it might be a mess. But I found a place where the cars would be sheltered after they passed the last bad-looking bit and could wait for the wounded to be brought across the pontoon bridge. I would have liked to drive over the new road, but it was not yet finished. It looked wide, made well, with a good grade, and then the turns looked very impressive where you could see them through the openings in the forest on the mountainside. The cars would be all right with their good metal-to-metal brakes, and anyway, coming down, they would not be loaded. I drove back up the narrow road. 2 carabinieri held the car up, police officers. A shell had fallen, and while we waited, 3 others fell up the road. They were 77s, and they came with a whooshing rush through the air, a hard bright burst, and a flash, and then gray smoke that blew across the road. The carabinieri waved us to go on. Passing where the shells had landed, I avoided the small broken places and smelled the high explosive and the smell of the blasted clay and stone, and freshly shattered flint. I drove back to Gorzia and our villa, and as I said, I went to call on Miss Barkley, who was on duty. At dinner, I ate very quickly and left for the villa where the British had their hospital. It was really very large and beautiful, and there were fine trees in the grounds. Miss Barkley was sitting in the bench in the garden, and Miss Ferguson was with her. They seemed glad to see me, and in a little while Miss Ferguson excused herself, and she went away. "I'll leave you two," Ferguson said. "You'll get along very well without me." "Don't go, Helen," Miss Barkley said. "I'd rather, really. I must write some letters." "Good night," I said. "Good night, Mr. Henry." And now we know the narrator's name. Henry. Mr. Henry. Lieutenant Henry. Now we've got the narrator pegged, right? Don't write anything that will bother the censor. Don't worry, I only write about what a beautiful place we live in and how brave the Italians are. Well, that way you'll get decorated. That'll be nice. Good night, Catherine. And now we know Catherine Barkley's name, Catherine Barkley. "I'll see you in a little while," Miss Barkley said. Miss Ferguson walked in the dark. "She's nice," I said. "Oh, yes, very nice. She's a nurse." "Aren't you a nurse?" "Oh, no," Barkley says. "I'm something called a VAD. We work very hard, but no one trusts us. VAD stands for Voluntary Aid Detachment, a group of civilians who volunteer to provide nursing care to military personnel during World War I. So she's a volunteer. She's not really a nurse. She's a volunteer. Why not? They don't trust us when there's nothing going on. When there is really work, then they trust us. What's the difference? Asks Lieutenant Henry. A nurse is like a doctor. It takes a long time to be. A VAD, that's a shortcut. I see. The Italians didn't want women so near the front, Barkley says. So we're all on our very special behavior. We don't go out. I can come here, though, he says. Oh, yes, we're not cloistered. Let's drop the war, he says. It's very hard. There's no place to drop it. Let's drop it anyway, he says. All right. We looked at each other in the dark. I thought she was very beautiful, and I took her hand. She let me take it, and I held it, and then I put my arm around under her arm. No, she said. I kept my arm where it was. Why not? No. Yes, I said, please. I leaned forward in the dark to kiss her, and there was a sharp, stinging flash. She slapped my face hard. Her hand had hit my nose and eyes, and tears came in my eyes from the reflex. I'm so sorry, she said. I felt I had a certain advantage. You were quite right, says Lieutenant Henry. I'm dreadfully sorry, she said. I just couldn't stand the nurse's evening off aspect of it. I didn't mean to hurt you. I did hurt you, didn't I? She was looking at me in the dark. I was angry, and yet certain, seeing it all ahead, like the moves in a chess game. You did exactly right, I said. I don't mind at all. Poor man. You see, I've been leading a sort of funny life, he says, and I never even talk English. And then you're so very beautiful. And I looked at her. She says, you don't need to say a lot of nonsense. I said I was sorry. We do get along. Yes, I said. And we've gotten away from the war. She laughed. It was the first time I had ever heard her laugh. I watched her face. You're sweet, she said. No, I'm not. Yes, you're a dear. I'd be glad to kiss you if you don't mind. I looked in her eyes and put my arm around her as I had before and kissed her. I kissed her hard and held her tight and tried to open her lips. They were closed tight. I was still angry, and as I held her, suddenly she shivered. I held her close against me, and I could feel her heart beating, and her lips opened, and her head went back against my hand, and then she was crying on my shoulder. Why is he angry? I want you to think about that. He's angry. I was still angry. Oh, darling, she said, you'll be good to me, won't you? What the hell, I thought. I stroked her hair and patted her shoulder. She was crying. You will, won't you? She looked up at me. Because we're going to have a strange life. After a while, I walked with her to the door of the villa, and she went in and I walked home. Back at the villa, I went upstairs to my room, and Rinaldi was lying in his bed, and he looked at me. I want you to think about this, and we're going to stop for just a second. After a while. How long is a while? What happened in a while? I want you to think about this because it's not clear. He never says what happened. He never says why it happened. He just says, after a while, I walked with her to the door of the villa. She went in, and I walked home. Did or did not something happen? And if something happened, what did happen? And if nothing happened, why didn't it happen? Or did it happen? Rinaldi was lying on his bed. So, you make progress with Miss Barkley, huh? We're friends. You have the pleasant air of a dog in heat. Now, this is the third person narrator is narrating the dialogue, right? This is Lieutenant Henry recording what Rinaldi says. You have the pleasant air of a dog in heat. He's talking what Rinaldi said about himself. But I didn't understand the word. Of a what? He explained what it was. You, I said, have the pleasant air of a dog who. And see this line here? That's a dash that signals what? That's a punctuation mark that signals what? That either he stopped short talking or he said something obscene, a swear word. You, I said, have the pleasant air of a dog who. Stop it, he said. In a little while we would be saying insulting things. And so he laughed. Good night, I said. Good night, little puppy. I knocked over his candle with the pillow and got into bed in the dark. Rinaldi picked up the candle, lit it, and went on reading. So we're going to stop there with this reading, and we're going to think about this last encounter with Miss Barkley. War does strange things to people. War, imminent danger, imminent life, death situations, does strange things to people. So in here, we know Miss Barkley lost her fiancé. She was engaged 8 years, never married him, and he was blown to bits in the Somme. He didn't have a saber cut, kind of like romantic. And most people during World War I, when World War I was about to start, or after it did start, thought it was a great, great thing because most people had the wrong idea of war. Because before World War I, war was kind of like picturesque, like she said. You know, you had cavalry, you had sabers, you had some guns, right? But World War I changed all that. It was very, very, very bad. Lots of death, lots of wounds. And they didn't have the medicine that you have nowadays where, you have, if you watch MASH, they treat you immediately and then they evacuate you, save a lot of lives like that. This was different. So she's a little off. Do you know what he's after? You know what he's after, right? And so did he or did he not get his wish with Miss Barkley in this scene after a while? That's something for you to contemplate. There's theories he did. Some of the movies say he did. Some of the theories say he didn't. They just talked and he comforted her. I don't think so because he's not angry, or is he? He was angry because what he wanted to do was just have sex, right? We're going to find out about Lieutenant Henry. He's a very sensual guy, very sensual. You can tell the way he describes the countryside. His senses are always hypersensitive, right? The pebbles, the scenery, the front, the mechanics working on it. So he's a man of senses, the five senses. And obviously he was hitting on Miss Barkley. And at first she slaps him, but that doesn't deter him. And if you notice this sentence right here, and yet certain seeing it all head like moves in a chess game. He knows exactly what he's doing, and he's taking advantage of her. Would you agree with that? I would agree with that. She's she's obviously, right, off a little bit when she says we're going to have, or is it true, we're going to have a strange life. She's making a commitment here, I think. We're going to find out. You've been reading with Jimmy. This is Jimmy. You're reading a couple of more chapters, right? In A Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway. Keep reading with me. This is a long novel. If you have questions, email me, Jimmy at readingwithjimmy.com. Jimmy at readingwithjimmy.com. Thanks so much for being here. Look forward to seeing you soon.